Dear all, many thanks for joining us for the second event of this term's Space Syntax Lab seminars. Today, we will hear a talk by Francesca Froy on the spatial and economic structures that make agglomeration economies work in Greater Manchester, where she will talk us through her research combining space syntax analysis with economic network analysis to better understand the functioning of urban economies. Francesca has recently completed her PhD at the Space Syntax Lab, and she's currently a visiting lecturer on urban economies at the Bartlett School of Planning, and also an honorary policy fellow at UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Francesca's research centers on the use of network theory to better understand economic diversity and complexity. And her work has been published in numerous peer-reviewed academic journals, including the Oxford Review of Economic Policy and the European Planning Journal. In her work, Francesca can draw on over 20 years of experience in the field of policy research and advice. And for example, until 2015, she was a senior policy analyst at the OECD. And with this, I'm looking forward to an exciting talk and hand over to you, Francesca.
Well, thank you very much, Keeman, for the introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be with you all today. Fantastic to see so many people here. So I'm going to be sharing with you the results of my PhD, which, as Keeman said, I did at the UCL Space Syntax Lab under the supervision of Dr. Sam Griffiths and Professor Laura Vaughan. And my PhD was really looking at how you bring together space syntax with economic network theory. And what I wanted to explore was what Jane Jacobs called the marvelous order that you find in cities associated with complexity. And I chose as my case study Greater Manchester. So Greater Manchester, for people who don't know it well, was really one of the original Industrial Revolution cities in the UK. So from the 18th century onwards, it became a real centre for industrial production, but also commerce. And you can see in the centre of the city today, still the buildings associated with the commerce, with the warehousing, but also you can see the chimney in the background here from the many factories that were based in this city. And if you walk around Greater Manchester today, you often see this symbol of the worker bee. So you see it on murals, you see it in sculptures, even on shop windows. And what's nice about this is that people are obviously identifying still in Manchester with the idea of being industrious workers. But at the same time, they often celebrate Manchester as a hive of industry. So it's long been known as a hive. And I think this really speaks to the idea of cities being more than the sum of their parts. So cities are places where people can come together and really become more productive. And of course, this is an idea which is common within the agglomeration economies literature. So economists, particularly in recent years, have been very interested in this idea that large and dense cities boost productivity. And there's a common understanding now that economic activity doesn't level out across regions. What you end up is with very spiky economic development concentrated in particular places. And when economists and particularly economic geographers think about these issues, they draw on ideas that went right back to Alfred Marshall back in 1890. He started to talk about agglomeration economies. So he talked about the multiple economic interdependencies that can happen between firms when they become concentrated in particular places, like Sheffield, which played host to metalworking industries, but also Lancashire, which played host to textiles, where Manchester is based. So he talked about the threefold influence of firms sharing labour, but also sharing products in supply chains, and also sharing knowledge, so knowledge spillovers. And when Alfred Marshall talked about agglomeration economics, he was talking really about single sectors, what are now known as localization economies. But increasingly, we're aware that it's not just specialized sectors that benefit from being together in space or in proximity, but also diverse sectors. So you get what's now known as urbanization economies, cross-sector dynamics, where you get labor sharing, skills sharing, knowledge sharing, but also product sharing across quite diverse industries in cities. But when you look at the literature, often when people analyze agglomeration economies, they do this in a rather timeless way. So you often find snapshots which look at how all of these different externalities in cities contribute towards economic dynamism, not necessarily taking a historical approach. So in my own analysis, what I wanted to do was inject ideas of time and history. So to see agglomeration economies as very much an evolutionary thing. But I also wanted to explore the structure of economic diversity. So there's increasing evidence that it's not just random economic diversity that we find in cities, but actually these interdependencies have a structure, a topological structure. So in space syntax, we're very used to the idea that street networks have a topological structure, but I think the same can be said for economies. So there are certain sectors that are more likely to relate to each other. There are forms of proximity, I suppose, between sectors that exist in an economic sense as well as a spatial sense. And as I mentioned, I also wanted to bring space syntax into the mix, because I think often when we talk about agglomeration economies, there's an idea that it's density that counts or it's size that counts, but there isn't really an understanding about how the configuration of cities, the structure of cities might actually really influence the way that they operate economically. So in the presentation I'm going to do, I'll start by talking about this historical nature of agglomerations as branching economies. I'll then go on to talk about how economic and spatial structures can be analysed together. And finally, hoping I have time, I will also talk about whether the capacity of Greater Manchester's spatial structure to support economic prosperity has been in decline over history, and particularly since the 1950s. So to start with this idea of cities as branching economies. So this idea is very much associated with Jane Jacobs and her book, 1969, The Economy of Cities. So in this book, she talks about the idea of new work in cities developing on the basis of old. So she has a rather famous example of a dressmaker in New York who had problems with the fit of the dresses she was making on her clients. So she actually started to experiment with underwear and ended up producing bras for the first time. So she created a spin-off industry, really, and she actually ended up focusing all of her time on this new industry and abandoning her old line of dressmaking work. And when she did this spin out, she was really able to take advantage of the diversity that existed in her New York neighborhood, all the different firms that she could collaborate with to create her new firm. And Jane Jacobs talks about cities as being perfect places for this branching to happen, because not only of their diversity, but also the existence of financing and space, and the embeddedness of cities in much broader international trading networks of importing and exporting. And Jane Jacobs saw economic development in cities as very much being an emergent process. So just as in space syntax, we think of street networks as being emergent, as developing incrementally in a form of self-organization in a way. Also, Jane Jacobs thought the same thing happened with economies. So you couldn't plan them top down. You really needed to let them flourish and you needed to let the division of labor happen as a dynamic process that involves this branching from generalities. And these ideas of economic activity in cities branching and developing over time are also found within the economic geography discipline of evolutionary economic geography, associated with people like Ron Borschner from the University of Utrecht. And what's interesting in some of this literature is you realize that this economic branching leaves an imprint really in the current industrial structure of a place. which then constrains and enables future diversification paths. So as I already mentioned, there are certain sectors within cities that are more likely to be related to each other today, in part because they've branched together over history. And you call this related variety. There are also people who talk about economic complexity in cities, and the idea that all of this is an interdependent, kind of complex adaptive system. And because you get this path interdependency across sectors, you then end up with place dependency. And one branch of this literature, which I've been particularly exploring, is the literature on industry relatedness. And this actually involves constructing economic networks between industry sectors using microdata. So they're actually, they go beyond looking at standard industrial classifications to build networks based on labor movements between different sectors, product chains and supply chains, and even cross-sector referencing in patents. So they use this to actually build complex networks, and I'm going to talk you through one or two of these a bit later in the presentation. But I wanted to start by just exploring in a more of a qualitative way how Greater Manchester's economy has branched over time. So it began really centred around textiles. So the Industrial Revolution was very much about textiles. But you can see these interdependencies already. So you can see that the chemicals industry, for example, also developed in the same city, in the same region, really in tandem with textiles, but also supporting textiles. So, for example, the dyes and bleaches that were used in textile and clothing production also sort of morphed or developed into time into paints. You see the development of rubbers and plastics in Greater Manchester and its region, and you also see the development of synthetic fibres. So what's interesting about that is the chemical sector then came back to actually influence the textiles themselves, because they increasingly became dominated by these synthetic fibres. You also get engineering developing and evolving over time, and ultimately a lot of electrical engineering in the city. You see how textiles printing developed into art and in fact the Manchester School of Art. You can also see that the city's financial services and knowledge-based services link back to all of the different merchants and financiers and bankers who are based in the city, again supporting the textiles industry. And it's interesting, one of the things that Jane Jacobs talks about is that a lot of this innovation that happens in cities is based on problem solving and trial and error, often based on the materials at hand or the technologies at hand. And you can really see this in the newspaper articles about the development of the chemicals industry, for example. It wasn't scientists necessarily that were taking things forward, it was plumbers and vinegar makers, veterinary surgeons and dilettantes. And there was a celebration of the idea of experimentation rather than production. And you can really see this looking at one particular industry which was increasingly important in Greater Manchester, which was the waterproofing industry. So I've been looking at this in more detail. And in fact, it was actually Charles McIntosh who came from Glasgow, who was experimenting with the waste products of gasworks, who produced naphtha, a byproduct of gasworks, which was then used to dissolve Indian rubber. And he came down to Manchester and actually used his new invention, drawing on all the capabilities that were already in the city in terms of clothes and textile production. And he set up, in a set of mills right next to a gasworks. And the romantic story would be he actually used the byproduct of the gasworks to make his raincoats. But in fact, I think there were some municipal restrictions which prevented that happening, at least immediately. But he really drew on what was already there in the city to produce this new line of work. And over time, waterproofs in Manchester diversified in all sorts of different ways. So there were many different local companies and also larger companies that sprung up in the city, exploiting different diversification surfaces, I think, around materials and finishes, body shapes, also the environment. And what was quite interesting was there was a development later on in a leisure, sort of set of leisure garments, waterproof garments, around mountain sports and cycling. And this was actually partly because people in Manchester had started walking and mountaineering in the adjacent Pennines region, but also alongside workers from Sheffield who are more specialised in metalworking, and actually producing a whole new set of kit really for these climbers and these walkers. So you can see that even user-led innovation draws on these capabilities that are based in particular cities. So how might all of this influence the way that we understand the current industrial structure of a place? So as I mentioned, within the industrial relatedness literature, you get people creating these quite complex economic networks. So a key figure in this field is Frank Nefker. And what he's done is analyze labour flows between industries to see how different industrial sectors might be related to each other in terms of the skills that they use and harness. So he talks about skills overlap between industries. And this is a map using one of his skills relatedness networks, which I've adapted to Greater Manchester. So all of the nodes that are in darker colours here and with the darker fonts are actually industries that are particularly concentrated in the city according to their employment figures. And the edges, so the links between these nodes, is the degree of skills overlap. So to the extent to which they share common skills and capabilities. So what's immediately interesting is that you can see this cluster in the top center of the network of all of these chemicals and paints and gases and all those sorts of industries that we've already talked about having evolved longer term in the city. They're still there today and they're still interrelated. But you can also see other clusters. So you can see more on the left-hand bottom side of this network, again, some of these financial services, legal services that are still concentrated in the city today. And again, you know, all these relationships in terms of potential labour sharing and skills and knowledge sharing that you can see. So it's difficult to see economies in cities as you know, a bunch of separate random sectors. When you look at networks like this, you can see all of the interdependencies that exist. And things get even more complicated if you actually look at it at a finer industrial grain. So that previous network was looking at 2-digit NACE codes, and that breaks down the economic structure into about 100 different industries. This is using 4-digit codes, which breaks it down into over 600 industries. And again, I've highlighted the nodes which are specialised in Manchester here, but it's very difficult to read unless you also think about the modularity of this sort of a network. So in fact, industry-related networks often have modularity. And what I mean here is that they break down into different communities of nodes that are more related to each other than they're related to the overall network. So the skills relatedness matrix here, it actually breaks down when you analyze it through using software like Gen Leuven into all of these different sort of clusters around engineering and textiles and chemicals and construction. And what you can then do is look in more detail at those communities, and then it becomes a bit more legible and easy to understand. But what's fascinating is, I mean, if you look at sort of traditional industrial classification, you often have a very clear line of separation between the manufacturing sectors and the wholesale sectors and the retail sectors. But actually, if you look at these emergent communities that come from the network analysis, you can see that actually within textiles and clothing here, you have all of those together. So you have the wholesalers, you have the technical textile workers, you have all of these different sort of interdependencies going across standard industrial boundaries. And another thing which is interesting is that more traditional activities like textiles weaving here would seem to have skills overlaps common capabilities with much more advanced forms of manufacturing, like technical textiles. So again, looking at these networks, we start to be challenged, I suppose, in our conventional economic thinking. I've also been looking at the extent to which those communities are particularly embedded within Greater Manchester. So perhaps not surprisingly, again, you find that textiles and clothing, all of the subsectors within that community are particularly embedded still in Greater Manchester, and the same goes for chemicals. But they're fairly inward-looking sectors in terms of their linkages, whereas some of the other sectors in the city, so engineering and knowledge-based services, have much more extensive links across the rest of the economy, which makes me think that they're really helping to reproduce the city economy as a whole. And what's nice about all of this literature, I think, about capabilities in cities is it goes beyond the idea of just looking at skills. We're looking at the capabilities that are embedded not only in people, but also in technologies, in working practices, even in buildings associated with these different industrial sectors. And then thinking about how there's an interchange between them. And I've talked already about skills relatedness, but you can also think about supply chain relatedness. So I've also been doing network analysis around the sorts of supply chains that you might expect to see in Manchester. So you get these aggregations of know-how and capability which make the city economy work. And if you want to explore this in more detail, there's a really nice book by Cesar Hidalgo called How Information Grows. I've just put a couple of pictures here. I did company interviews as part of my PhD, and it was really interesting talking to the company managers about how interchangeable for them different capabilities were. So they were equally happy to use a technology or to use a worker to do something, or indeed to bring in a supplier to do a particular part of their production. And they often change between these different capabilities as they worked. So how can we fit space into all of this? How can we look at spatial structures and space syntax alongside these complicated economic networks? So I started doing rather standard space syntax analysis, looking at Greater Manchester and how it works in terms of integration and accessibility. So for example, you can see here at the 2 kilometre radius scale for integration, that Greater Manchester is rather polycentric in its form. So in fact, the combined authority Greater Manchester region is made up of not only the centre of Manchester and Salford and Trafford, but also a lot of surrounding towns which now make now a part of the functional urban area and indeed its extended urban fabric. I also analysed choice, so I analysed those streets in the system that were more likely to have betweenness, centrality and through movement. And what I did then was isolate the top 12.5% of the street segments, so I could then impose this foreground network on other maps which showed economic data. Because I wanted to start just by understanding where all these different economic activities were based in the city. Are they prioritising accessibility at the urban scale? And indeed they were. So I did quite fine-grained analysis across many different sectors, but I just wanted to pick out the finding that in fact small manufacturing firms are very much found right across the city of Greater Manchester. So this uses FAME data from Orbis. And what I've shown here, I think, is that these when you look at the number of firms, they're very much based in these central areas, but also quite linearly organised around the foreground network. But when I looked at it in finer detail, I found that actually they weren't on the foreground network itself, they were in the back streets. Which is, I think, a finding that Fiona Scott has had in London, but also Laura Navaez in Cardiff. that manufacturing seems to be found close to accessibility, but just a bit distant to it, because manufacturers often need larger amounts of land for production, and therefore are trying to perhaps save on the costs of the land that they use. But to point out that this fact that manufacturing seems to prioritize accessibility isn't necessarily understood in policy. And in fact, Greater Manchester was the home of the very first industrial park. And I don't know if you can see in this slide, this huge area the Trafford Industrial Park has, compared to the city centre, which is highlighted for integration here in red. You know, a very large industrial park, but relatively separated from the rest of the urban fabric, which might mean that the manufacturers that are based there aren't really capitalising on the agglomeration economies of the city as a whole. I also explored the location of economic activities over history. So coming back to this story about the waterproofing industries, I was able to find on the 1950s maps where all of these waterproofing firms, or at least the formal waterproofing firms, were based in the north of the city in a relatively dispersed cluster. But also look in much more detail at certain neighbourhoods. So Laura Vaughan has explored this neighbourhood of Cheetham Hill and Broughton and Strangeways in the north of the city, where there was a strong Jewish community and a spatial culture, which was really interesting in supporting the waterproofing industry in this particular area. And indeed, today, some of the old waterproofing factory buildings are still there, but now they're housing fashion wholesale, as I'll mention in a minute. So after exploring where economic activities were located in the city, I also wanted to think again about these Marshallian factors, you know, these relationships that happen in cities in terms of the sharing of labour and supply chains and knowledge spillovers. So I think there are different spatial affordances associated with these different interrelationships. So when you think about how cities allow the sharing of labour, you have to think about commuting times, the speed of daily transit. If you're thinking about knowledge spillovers and innovation, it's interesting to think about how cities support spontaneous encounter and the exchange of information. Bill Hillier called or talked about the real importance of people meeting contacts of the right kind. So again, thinking about how, you know, the people that you meet need to be close enough in what they're doing to you to actually be cognitively, you can actually communicate your ideas to them effectively and absorb their ideas, but still there's a difference which allows new innovation to develop. It's really interesting also to see how messy spaces in cities allow the kind of bottom-up experimentation and innovation that Jane Jacobs was so fond of. The experimentation with materials and technologies, which often leads to new lines of work. But I wanted to go into a bit more detail about supply chains, because I think within space syntax, we're very used to thinking of movement economies as being about the pedestrian movement that happens in cities. But I think there's also a movement economy around the movement of goods. And the delivery of goods often requires quite particular affordances in terms of back streets and yards, but also more familiar aspects like multi-scalar accessibility. So in Greater Manchester, what's really interesting is that you see not only foreground streets, but also back streets. So a lot of the streets in parallel to foreground network streets in Manchester are actually called back, that they have back in their name. So Piccadilly has very close by back Piccadilly, and Turner Street has back Turner Street. And these back streets have been really important over history, I think, in producing or allowing this movement of goods, which is so important. Coming back to this multi-scale reach idea, so this area that I've already touched upon, Strangeways in the north of the city, what's interesting is that it's quite a nice griddy urban area, but it's within two prongs of the foreground network, which really connects the area into national and international flows of goods. And the result of that is an amazing cluster of fashion wholesalers that are based in this area at the moment. So they're bringing in goods from all over the world, but also selling them on to retailers from all over the country. And if you explore that area, it's quite remarkable, all the different goods that you can see in the shop windows, but you're not able to buy them. They're for trade only. So the other thing that I wanted to do, and I suppose it's the most important innovation in my PhD, is to think about this idea of related industries and how they might be spatially located. So do related industries, so these industries that are particularly likely to share skills or products or knowledge, are they located in the same cities? And within cities, are they located within the same neighborhoods? So how far does spatial proximity also matter for economic proximity? So what I did was actually start doing some statistical analysis, and I took these three types of interdependency that I've already mentioned, so skills relatedness, supply chain relatedness, and patent cross-referencing, using microdata from the UK and beyond. And I then looked at these skewed networks and how they might be related to the actual co-agglomeration of industries in English functional urban areas. So I drew on a variety of different sorts of data to do this. And I worked in conjunction with Dr. Nevo Cleary in CASA, who's been very helpful in working out how to do this sort of regression based on networks. And what's really interesting is that it does seem that those industries that share skills and labour and products are more likely to be found in the same English city. And to some extent that wasn't surprising, because similar results have been found in different countries around the world. But what's useful here is to understand that supply chain relatedness is particularly important at the urban scale. So industries tend to be located in the same English cities as other industries with whom they share products. And manufacturing firms seem to particularly benefit from this. So again, we're seeing manufacturing firms actually really benefit from accessibility at the urban scale, or co-accessibility, which I don't think we always recognise. But coming back to this idea about economic communities, what does that mean in terms of how industrial sectors are actually located within cities? So can you also see that certain economic communities are located within certain parts of the city? Does proximity also play a role at that scale? So I looked at one of these communities around engineering. Well, actually, I looked at all of them, but I just wanted to show, today I wanted to show one of them, which is engineering and hard manufacturing. And if you look at all of the different data points in FAME or Orbis, all of the different firms that might be associated with this economic community in Manchester, you can see that actually, no, it's right across the board. So it comes back to an idea that Sam Griffiths has talked about, that the city functions as one giant workshop. And indeed, Sam was talking about Sheffield and the metalworking industry there. So that sort of suggests that maybe relatedness isn't quite so important at the very local scale. But then I explored that again through statistics and regression analysis. So I did the same, ran the same analysis that I did at the scale of English functional urban areas, but this time just at the scale of neighbourhoods in Greater Manchester. And here I found a different result, which is actually that the related industries that tend to want to be, or tend to be found together at the very neighbourhood scale, are those that share skills and labour. And indeed, in Greater Manchester, it's particularly knowledge-based services that are more likely to co-agglomerate. So I wanted to explore that in a bit more detail. And I started looking at those industries that are particularly found in the same neighbourhoods, the same MSOAs in Greater Manchester, and then looked at the relationships that might exist or might be expected to exist between those industries. So, for example, looking at the creative sector, I could see that there were different sectors around advertising, motion picture, sound and TV, creative industries and management and consulting, all likely to be in the same neighbourhood. But then I looked at what their industrial relatedness might be. And what's interesting is that the creative sector, as it's defined, so I think that's art and entertainment, performing arts, operation of arts facilities, tends to be found with in kind of common local labour pools with motion picture and management consulting, which is perhaps not so surprising. But also, actually, the creative industries also can be found close to financial services and information services. And in this case, it's more a case of supply chain relatedness, which might be important. So I experimented then with thinking about how you might map this. So this is a part of Greater Manchester called Altrincham in the southwest, quite a prosperous part of the city. And I looked, so the orange dots here are these creative sector firms, but these other dots in the map are those firms from those industries that are usually co-located with the creative sector in Greater Manchester. And then what I did was look at whether you could sort of colour up those dots according to the potential relatedness of those firms. So what I was doing really was exploring a field of collaborative potential in Altrincham. And the dots here, which are red, are those firms with which the creative sector might share labour and skills, whereas the blue ones are firms with which they might share supplies and products. I think what's interesting is it really kind of helps to substantiate a very nice idea in Howard Davis's book, Working Cities. And I know Howard's here, I think, today, which is great. That firms can lean on a knowledge base in a particular neighbourhood. So they're not isolated. They can actually, feed off the capabilities that are in a given part of the city. And it's not just knowledge, obviously, it's also that they can feed off supplies. So again, coming back to Jane Jacobs' idea that new firms can take advantage of all the potential suppliers that are around them when they develop a new line of work. So I'm aware I've kind of rushed through things, and I hope there'll be some time to talk and answer questions at the end. But I just wanted to finish by talking about this idea that maybe the spatial structure of cities, it doesn't stay the same over time, as we know. And maybe that actually also changes the economic potential that a place has. So we tend to think of agglomeration economies as a rather static thing. Once you've got your size, the size of your city, and you've got the density, that agglomeration economies might just happen automatically. But actually, maybe if the spatial configuration of a city changes, its economic potential can also be undermined. So again, I've been exploring this historically and looking at how. So this is actually a foreground. These are images of the foreground network of Greater Manchester over history, but only looking at those streets which have a normalised choice value of 1.4 or over, which is really the minimum that Bill Hillier thought was important or sufficient for a foreground network to really knit together all the different aspects of the urban fabric. And whereas in the 1850s, the Industrial Revolution city of Greater Manchester had a really lovely coherent foreground network, and it persisted until the 1950s, gradually it's really started to decline. And this is partly because from the 1950s onwards, there was a real investment in planning, really, to both sort of get rid of some of the terraced grids, which were very synonymous with Manchester, but also introduce new inner urban expressways and ring roads, which really have kind of taken over these 1.4 normalised choice streets today. And I won't go into this in detail, but when you compare Greater Manchester to all of the other cities which Bill Hillier and his colleagues analysed in 2012 for their normalised choice values, both mean and maximum, Greater Manchester doesn't really perform very well. And it seems to particularly have a discontinuous background network of streets today compared to other cities. And I think part of the reason is that the city has gradually prioritised its connection into the UK-wide network of streets. So using Space Syntax's open mapping resource, I've been looking at the percentage of the street network falling within the top 10% of values for integration and choice across all English core cities. And Greater Manchester really performs well in terms of integration at the 100-kilometre scale. And I think this connectedness is really good for parts of the economy, like wholesaling and logistics, which really rely on these national and international connections. But I think this isn't so good for those capabilities which were being shared so effectively in the city, which don't prioritise necessarily that extent, that degree of connectivity. These local and citywide links seem to be undermined. And at the same time, unfortunately, the city is losing some of its messy spaces, and particularly its spaces for manufacturing and small manufacturing firms right in the heart of the city. And particularly some of the old mill buildings, which used to play host to lots of small-scale manufacturers in recent years, are becoming residential. So you get a twofold, well, it's a threefold thing in Greater Manchester, actually. You get a change in the configurational structure, a loss of some of these messy spaces, but also problems around density, which I haven't had time to go into today, associated with some of the voids left behind by the old industrial uses in the city. So to conclude, I hope that I've showed you that urban economic potential isn't just about size and agglomeration. It's actually about the intertwined capabilities that cities can bring together, and that spatial configuration is really important in bringing those capabilities together across multiple scales. So branching and diversification leaves its trace in cities. And actually what's interesting is to think, well, you know, all of those industry sectors that are here today in Greater Manchester, could we imagine how they would branch in the future, and perhaps to be more sustainable? So I'm particularly interested, for example, in how Greater Manchester's clothing and textile sector and its chemicals could actually work together to create new biodegradable coatings and materials. So cities are all about synergy, I think, and they can be messy and they can accommodate redundancy, because all of this creates a kind of a growth which isn't necessarily just about efficiency. It's about diversification, and I suppose therefore also about resilience. But people need to be perhaps more aware that configuration can change over time and therefore undermine all of these economic processes. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to some questions.